October 17, 1943. A basement interrogation room in the village of Cassino, Italy. The walls were damp stone that smelled of mildew and old mortar. A single electric bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Marie-Thérèse Marchand sat at a wooden table between two men who spoke different languages but shared the same exhaustion in their eyes. On her left, an American intelligence officer with a cigarette burning down to his knuckles. On her right, a captured German sergeant with dried blood crusting the collar of his uniform. She was 26 years old. Fluent in 7 languages. And already tired of translating fear. The American asked a question about Wehrmacht troop movements north of the Gustav Line. Marie-Thérèse translated it into German, watching the sergeant's face for micro-expressions of recognition or deception. The German replied that he knew nothing, that he was just a medical orderly, that he had only been trying to save lives. As she translated his words back into English, she noticed something the American officer missed. The way the sergeant's voice softened when he mentioned saving lives. The way his hands trembled when he described pulling wounded men from rubble. He wasn't lying about being a medic. He was telling the truth about trying to preserve life in a war designed to extinguish it. The American officer lit another cigarette and asked more questions. Marie-Thérèse translated. The German answered. She translated again. This went on for 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, she became something neither man could be. She became the bridge between their worlds. The only person in the room who understood both their words and their silences. This was her war. Not fought with weapons. Not won with territory. But conducted in a liminal space between languages, where confession and interrogation blurred into something more human and more terrible. Marie-Thérèse Marchand had been born in Geneva to a Swiss father and a French mother. Her childhood had been shaped by languages the way other children's were shaped by playgrounds. French at home. German in school. Italian from her grandmother who had fled Mussolini's early years. English from her father's business associates. Spanish, Russian, and Polish acquired later through private tutors and an insatiable appetite for literature. By 1939, she could navigate the nuances of 7 languages with the same ease most people reserved for their native tongue. She understood not just vocabulary and grammar, but context and implication. The way certain words carried different weight depending on who spoke them. The way silence could mean consent in one language and refusal in another. When war broke out, she was studying linguistics at the University of Geneva. She had plans to become a professor. To spend her life analyzing the evolution of Romance languages or perhaps researching Proto-Indo-European roots. But war consumed plans the way fire consumed paper. In 1940, after France fell and Switzerland's neutrality became an island in an ocean of violence, Marie-Thérèse made a decision. She could not fight. Her country would not fight. But she could speak. And in a war that stretched across a continent where a dozen languages collided in confusion and bloodshed, the ability to translate became its own kind of weapon. She offered her services to the International Committee of the Red Cross. They immediately recognized her value. A multilingual translator who could work in prisoner-of-war camps, interrogation centers, and field hospitals. Someone who could facilitate communication between armies that shared nothing except the determination to destroy each other. By 1943, she had worked in 7 different locations across Italy. She had translated for British officers interrogating Italian prisoners. For American field commanders negotiating with German deserters. For French resistance operatives debriefing captured Gestapo agents. And with every translation, she accumulated something that no one else in the war possessed. She accumulated the confessions of both sides. The American soldiers told her about their fear. About lying awake at night in foxholes listening to German artillery and wondering if the next shell would have their name on it. About the smell of their friends burning inside Sherman tanks. About writing letters home that said everything was fine when everything was absolutely not fine. The German prisoners told her about their exhaustion. About fighting a war they no longer believed in for a leader they had stopped trusting. About the horror of what they had seen done in the name of the Reich. About wanting nothing more than to survive long enough to return to families who might not exist anymore. The Italian civilians told her about their displacement. About watching their villages become battlegrounds between armies that treated their homes as tactical positions rather than places where children had been born and grandparents had died. About the impossible choice between starving under occupation or collaborating with whichever force happened to control their street that week. Marie-Thérèse translated all of it. She sat in that basement room in Cassino and dozens of rooms like it across Italy, converting fear into words and words back into fear in different languages. She became a repository for the private thoughts of men who would never meet but who shared the same fundamental terror. And the terrible thing she discovered was this: when you stripped away the uniforms and the ideologies and the flags, everyone confessed the same things. Everyone wanted the war to end. Everyone was afraid of dying. Everyone carried guilt about what they had done or failed to do. Everyone hoped that somewhere beyond the violence, normal life still existed. But she could never tell them that. Could never say to the American officer that the German sergeant across the table had the same nightmares. Could never tell the German prisoner that the American interrogator also woke up screaming. Her role was to translate the surface words, not the underlying humanity. Because if both sides understood how similar their fears were, if both sides recognized the shared exhaustion and guilt, perhaps neither could continue fighting. And the war needed translators more than it needed compassion. The interrogation in Cassino ended with the German sergeant giving up the location of a field hospital 7 kilometers north. The American officer thanked Marie-Thérèse for her translation and arranged for the prisoner to be transferred to a POW camp near Naples. After both men left, Marie-Thérèse remained at the wooden table for 20 minutes in the empty room. The light bulb swung slightly from ceiling vibrations caused by distant artillery. Shadows moved across the damp stone walls like ghosts. She thought about the German sergeant's hands trembling when he spoke about saving lives. She thought about the American officer's eyes that carried the same exhaustion she had seen in 100 other men's eyes. She thought about all the confessions she had translated and all the humanity she had witnessed and all the terrible knowledge accumulating in her memory like stones in a well. And she understood that her war was different from everyone else's war. She was fighting in a space between languages where the only casualty was her own certainty. Where every translation forced her to see the enemy as human and the allies as flawed and the line between right and wrong as blurred as a watercolor in rain. This was the problem she could not solve. This was the burden she carried into every interrogation room. She was the woman who heard confessions from both sides of the war. And the more she heard, the less she understood what any of it meant. January 1944. An American field hospital outside Anzio. Marie-Thérèse was summoned to translate for a captured German lieutenant who was recovering from wounds sustained during the Allied landing. The lieutenant's name was Klaus Weber. 23 years old. An engineering student from Munich before the war. Shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder and collapsed one lung. American doctors had saved his life with the same skill and dedication they applied to their own wounded. When Marie-Thérèse entered the recovery tent, she found Lieutenant Weber propped against pillows, his chest wrapped in bandages, morphine making his pupils large and unfocused. An American major stood beside the cot with a notebook and questions about German defensive positions around the beachhead. She introduced herself in German. Explained that she would translate questions from the American officer. Asked if he understood and if he was comfortable enough to speak. Klaus Weber looked at her with those morphine-dilated eyes and said something she would never forget. "I am comfortable dying," he said in German. "I stopped being comfortable living 2 years ago." She translated this for the American major as, "He is experiencing some discomfort but is capable of answering questions." The interrogation proceeded. The major asked about German reinforcements. Weber provided vague answers that contained just enough truth to be credible and just enough omission to protect his former comrades. Marie-Thérèse translated each exchange, maintaining the professional distance that her role required. But something had shifted. That single sentence, "I stopped being comfortable living 2 years ago," had opened a door she could not close. After the American major finished his questions and left the tent, Marie-Thérèse remained. She should have departed immediately. Her job was translation, not conversation. But she stayed. And Klaus Weber, alone in enemy hands with morphine loosening his tongue, began to confess. He told her about being conscripted in 1941. About believing in Germany's destiny because everyone around him believed it and questioning such things could get you arrested. About his first deployment to the Eastern Front where he had watched his engineering unit build bridges across Russian rivers while villages burned on both horizons. He told her about the things he had seen done to civilians. Not by him personally. He emphasized that. But by other soldiers. By SS units that moved through occupied territories like locusts through wheat fields. About the impossibility of objecting without being labeled a traitor or worse. He told her about the day his unit executed Soviet partisans in a village whose name he could no longer remember. 15 men and 3 women lined up against a schoolhouse wall. He had been ordered to photograph the execution for military records. Had stood 20 feet away with a camera while machine guns performed their function. I took the pictures, Klaus said in German. I developed them. I filed them. And then I went to dinner and ate potato soup and played cards with the other engineers. He looked at her with those dilated eyes. How does a person do that? How does a person witness murder and then eat soup? Marie-Thérèse had no answer. She was the translator. She dealt in words, not absolution. Klaus continued. He described his growing disillusionment. The way propaganda dissolved when confronted with reality. The way noble rhetoric about defending the fatherland sounded hollow after you had watched enough people die for it. The way survival became its own ideology, separate from whatever cause had started the war. Do you know what I pray for? He asked her. I don't pray for victory. I don't pray for Germany. I pray that I die before I have to kill anyone. That is my greatest fear now. Not death. Participation. She should have left the tent. Should have closed this conversation and returned to her professional duties. But something Klaus said had resonated with something she had been feeling for months. The exhaustion of carrying both sides' humanity. The moral weight of understanding. The American soldiers say similar things, she told him in German. Breaking her own rule. Revealing information that crossed the boundaries of her role. Klaus stared at her. They do. They fear the same things you fear. They carry the same guilt. They want the war to end for the same reasons. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tent flap moved in the cold January wind. Somewhere outside, an ambulance was arriving with more wounded. The war continued its work regardless of their conversation. Then why do we fight? Klaus asked. It was the question Marie-Thérèse had been avoiding for 2 years. The question that grew heavier with every interrogation she translated. If both sides feared the same things and wanted the same end and carried the same guilt, what exactly was the war accomplishing? But she had no answer. Because answering would require choosing a side. And the curse of the translator was that she could not choose. She existed in the space between sides, and that space was growing larger and more unbearable with each passing month. She visited Klaus Weber 3 more times during his recovery at the field hospital. Never with official sanction. Never as part of her translation duties. She would come after hours, sit beside his cot, and they would talk. Not interrogation. Not intelligence gathering. Just 2 people existing in a war neither of them had chosen and neither could escape. He told her about his family. A father who owned a bookshop in Munich. A mother who taught piano. A younger sister who wanted to become a doctor. He had not heard from them in 8 months. Did not know if they had survived the Allied bombing raids. Did not know if his letters were reaching them. She told him about Geneva. About her education. About the strange isolation of being Swiss in a continent at war. About watching all the countries around her destroy themselves while her nation maintained its neutral distance. But you are not neutral, Klaus observed. You translate for the Allies. I translate for whoever needs translation, she corrected. I've worked in German prison camps and Allied interrogation centers. I translate in all directions. But you must have preference. You must believe one side is right. She considered his question. It was the same question she asked herself in empty rooms after interrogations ended. Did she believe in Allied victory? In German defeat? In the moral superiority of democracy over fascism? I believe both sides are human, she finally answered. And I believe humans should not do what this war makes them do. Klaus smiled sadly. That is not a political position. That is just grief. He was right. And in that moment of recognition, Marie-Thérèse felt something inside her transform. She had been trying to maintain professional detachment. To be the neutral conduit for other people's words. To exist in a space between languages without judgment or preference. But Klaus Weber, with his morphine-wide eyes and his confession about photographing executions and his prayer not to have to kill, had shown her the impossibility of her position. There was no such thing as neutral translation. Every word she chose, every nuance she conveyed or omitted, every silence she allowed to exist contained judgment. She was not a bridge between worlds. She was a person forced to choose which world to prioritize with every sentence she translated. And the weight of those choices was accumulating into something she could no longer carry. Klaus Weber was transferred to a POW camp in North Africa 6 days after their final conversation. She never saw him again. Never knew if he survived the war or if he made it back to Munich to see if his family's bookshop still stood. But his question remained. Then why do we fight? And her inability to answer it marked the moment her transformation began. The moment she stopped being just a translator and became something else. A witness. A repository for confessions. A woman who understood too much to maintain the comfortable distance that ignorance allowed. The war was changing her in ways she could not articulate. Making her see things she could not unsee. Teaching her truths she wished she did not know. And the most terrible truth was this: everyone was right and everyone was wrong, and the translator was the only person who had to live with that contradiction. March 1944. A makeshift interrogation center in a requisitioned villa outside Rome. Marie-Thérèse translated for a captured SS officer who refused to speak except in carefully constructed lies designed to waste American intelligence resources. His name was Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Kessler. Career SS, true believer. He answered every question with the kind of fanatical precision that revealed nothing while appearing cooperative. His eyes never wavered. His voice never hesitated. He was a man who had found certainty in ideology and had never suffered the doubt that plagued lesser soldiers. Marie-Thérèse sat across from him and translated his answers with mechanical accuracy. She had encountered this type before. The ones who truly believed. Who saw the war as a crusade and themselves as crusaders. Who carried no doubt and therefore no guilt. They were easier to hate than men like Klaus Weber. But also more difficult to understand. The American interrogator, a colonel named Patterson who had lost his temper after 2 hours of circular answers, finally dismissed the prisoner and turned to Marie-Thérèse with exhausted frustration. "What the hell is wrong with these people?" Patterson asked in English. "How can they believe this shit?" Marie-Thérèse had translated variations of this question 100 times. American and British officers constantly asked how German soldiers could follow Hitler. How they could participate in atrocities. How they could maintain faith in a cause so obviously doomed and morally bankrupt. And she always gave the same diplomatic answer. Ideology creates powerful certainty. But Patterson pressed her. "You speak their language. You talk to them when we're not around. What do they actually say? What do they actually believe?" It was a dangerous question. Because answering honestly would mean revealing that she sometimes spoke to prisoners outside of official interrogations. Would mean admitting that she accumulated knowledge beyond what she translated in these rooms. "They believe they are defending their homeland," she said carefully. "They believe the alternative is worse than fighting. The alternative to losing is worse than this." Patterson gestured vaguely toward the window where the sound of distant artillery provided constant percussion. "Worse than this slaughter." Marie-Thérèse thought about Klaus Weber's confession about photographing executions. About the German sergeant in Cassino who trembled when discussing saving lives. About the SS officer who had just left this room carrying absolute conviction like armor. For some of them, she said slowly, believing they are right is the only thing that allows them to function. If they stopped believing, they would have to confront what they have done. And that confrontation would destroy them. Patterson stared at her. "Jesus Christ. You sound like you sympathize with them." Did she? That was the question that haunted her increasingly sleepless nights. Did understanding equal sympathy? Did translation require empathy? And if so, how much empathy before you crossed some invisible line from neutral observer to collaborator? "I sympathize with everyone," she finally answered. "That is the problem." Patterson softened. "You've been doing this too long." He was right. She had been doing this too long. 3 years of translating confessions from both sides. 3 years of accumulating other people's guilt and fear and doubt. 3 years of carrying the weight of understanding that no one else wanted to bear. That night, Marie-Thérèse returned to her small room in the requisition villa and did something she had avoided throughout the entire war. She wrote in her journal not as a translator, but as herself. Not recording what others said, but expressing what she felt. The entry began, "I no longer know which side I serve. I translate for the Allies, but I understand the Germans. I facilitate interrogations that extract information used to kill German soldiers, but I carry confessions from those same soldiers in my memory like personal burdens. Where does that leave me?" She continued writing for 2 hours. Filling pages with thoughts she had never spoken aloud. The terrible sameness she saw in all soldiers regardless of uniform. The way fear tasted identical in every language. The way guilt accumulated in the same psychological spaces whether the person carrying it fought for democracy or dictatorship. She wrote about the moral exhaustion of being the only person who understood both narratives. Of seeing the justified anger of Allied soldiers who fought against fascism while simultaneously hearing the desperate survival instinct of German soldiers who just wanted to go home. Of knowing that both truths existed simultaneously and that translating one did not negate the other. The consequence of her position was becoming clear. She was not building bridges between sides. She was being torn apart by the tension between them. In April, she translated for a French resistance operative who had captured a German intelligence officer near Lyon. The interrogation took place in a cellar that smelled of wine gone to vinegar. The French operative asked questions with the kind of personal hatred that came from 4 years of occupation. The German officer answered with the mechanical efficiency of a man who knew he was already dead. Marie-Thérèse translated between them, maintaining her professional distance. But afterward, the French operative pulled her aside. "You translate his words too gently," he said in French. "You remove the arrogance from his voice." It was true. She had been softening tones, smoothing rough edges, making confessions more palatable. Not consciously. But as an instinctive attempt to preserve some humanity in exchanges designed to strip it away. "I translate the content," she replied. "Not the effect. Content without effect is incomplete translation. You make them sound more human than they are." But that was the problem. They were human. The German officer with his mechanical answers was human. The SS captain with his fanatical certainty was human. Klaus Weber with his morphine confessions was human. Understanding that did not excuse their choices or negate their crimes. But it complicated the simple narratives that war required. The French operative left with his prisoner. Marie-Thérèse remained in the cellar that smelled of vinegar. She thought about softening translations. About removing arrogance and hatred and fear from voices that carried all three. About the impossible task of translating truth without translating the feeling that gave truth its power. She was changing the war in small ways with every choice she made. Making enemies sound more reasonable. Making confessions more sympathetic. Building understanding that perhaps should not exist between people trying to kill each other. Was this betrayal? Or was this the only ethical response to horror? By summer 1944, as Allied forces pushed northward through Italy and prepared for the invasion of France, Marie-Thérèse had translated for over 300 interrogations. She had heard confessions from Wehrmacht soldiers and SS officers and Italian fascists and German deserters and prisoners of every rank and ideology. And the accumulation of those confessions had created a burden she could no longer ignore. She carried the private thoughts of men from both sides. She knew their fears and their guilt and their doubts. She understood their humanity in ways that made simple moral judgments impossible. This was the consequence of being the translator. This was what happened when you heard confessions from both sides of the war. You became the keeper of truths that contradicted each other. You carried knowledge that made action difficult and judgment impossible. And you existed in a space between worlds where neither side fully trusted you and where you could no longer fully trust yourself. The burden was crushing her. And she had no one to confess to. Because who translates for the translator? August 1944. A former schoolhouse in Florence, now serving as an Allied interrogation center. Marie-Thérèse was asked to translate for a German prisoner who had information about defensive positions along the Gothic line in the Apennine Mountains. The prisoner was a 19-year-old private named Peter Hoffmann. He had been captured during a skirmish outside Pistoia. A bullet had grazed his skull, leaving him with a concussion and a bandage wrapped around his head that made him look like a child playing soldier. He was terrified. Not of interrogation. Of everything. His hands shook continuously. His eyes darted to every sound. When the American major entered the room to begin questioning, Peter flinched so violently he nearly fell from his chair. The major asked standard questions. Unit designation. Commander's name. Number of troops in his company. Peter answered in stammering German, his voice breaking on every third word. As Marie-Thérèse translated his responses, she noticed something in his eyes. The same 1,000-yard stare she had seen in shell-shocked soldiers from every army. The look of someone whose mind had been pushed past the point of recovery. Midway through the interrogation, the major asked Peter a direct question: "Did you participate in any actions against Italian civilians?" Peter's hands stopped shaking. For 5 seconds, he sat completely still. Then he began to cry. Not quiet tears. Convulsive sobbing that shook his entire body. He bent forward over the table, his bandaged head in his hands, and wept with the kind of grief that comes from places too deep for words. The American major looked uncomfortable. "Ask him what's wrong," Marie-Thérèse asked. Peter could not answer. Could only cry and shake and gasp for air between sobs. She waited. The major waited. The guards at the door shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Peter lifted his head and began to speak in German so rapid and desperate that she had to ask him to slow down. What he confessed was this. 3 weeks earlier, his unit had been ordered to conduct a reprisal action against a village north of Florence where partisans had attacked a German supply convoy. The orders came from a colonel Peter had never met. The orders were explicit. Kill everyone. Burn everything. Leave nothing standing. Peter's company had objected. These were mostly boys from small towns in Bavaria and Saxony. Conscripts who had been farmers and shop clerks before the war. They did not want to murder civilians. But the colonel had been clear. This was a legal order under the laws of reprisal. Refusal would be treated as mutiny and dealt with accordingly. So they went to the village. And they did what they were ordered to do. Peter described it in terrible detail. The way the villagers had initially thought they were there for a standard inspection. The way children had waved at them. The way it took 20 minutes for people to realize what was actually happening. The way the screaming started. He described shooting a woman who was running with a baby. He described the way she fell and the baby rolled from her arms and how he had to shoot the baby too because leaving it alive would have been worse. He described his friend from home, a boy named Matthias who had worked in his father's bakery, putting his rifle in his own mouth and pulling the trigger rather than continue. He described the village burning. The way the flames looked against the August sky. The way the smoke smelled. The way they had marched away from it afterward in complete silence because there were no words for what they had just done. Marie-Thérèse translated all of this for the American major. Her voice remained steady. Professional. She converted Peter's German confession into English testimony with the same mechanical accuracy she brought to every translation. But inside, something was breaking. The major asked follow-up questions. Peter answered. She translated. The interrogation continued for another hour. When it finished, the major thanked her and left to write his report. Peter was taken to a holding cell to await transfer to a POW camp. Marie-Thérèse remained in the schoolhouse room. The afternoon sun came through high windows, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. Outside, she could hear American soldiers laughing about something. Inside, she could still hear Peter crying. She thought about Klaus Weber's question, how does a person witness murder and then eat soup? And now she had the answer. A person does not. A person breaks. A person cries in an interrogation room 3 weeks later while confessing to strangers. A person carries it forever like a wound that never heals. But she had a new question. How does the translator carry these confessions? How does the person who bears witness to the witness continue to function? That night, Marie-Thérèse did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in a room that still smelled of chalk from when the building had been a school, and she replayed every interrogation she had translated. Every confession she had heard. Every moment of human horror she had converted from one language to another. Klaus Weber photographing executions. Peter Hoffmann shooting a woman with a baby. The French resistance operative whose hatred was justified by occupation. The American soldiers whose fear was justified by combat. The SS officer whose certainty was terrifying in its completeness. She carried all of them. Every confession. Every truth. Every contradictory reality that made the war simultaneously justified and unjustifiable. And she understood with sudden clarity that she could not continue. The burden of understanding was no longer sustainable. She was breaking under the weight of other people's guilt and her own inability to reconcile the contradictions she had accumulated. The next morning, she requested a meeting with the British major who coordinated Red Cross translators in Italy. She told him she needed to stop working in interrogation centers. That 3 years had been too long. That she needed assignment to hospital work or administrative duties or anything that did not require her to translate confessions. The major was sympathetic but firm. "We need you precisely because you've done this so long. You understand the prisoners. You can extract information others miss. We're preparing for the final push into northern Italy and we need experienced translators more than ever." "I cannot do this anymore," she said in English. "You can. You're the best translator we have. That is not the problem." Then what is? How could she explain? How could she articulate that understanding both sides had made her incapable of serving either? That she had heard too many confessions and carried too much humanity and existed in a moral space that was tearing her apart? "I know too much," she finally said. "I hear things that make the war impossible to comprehend. I translate confessions that make everyone simultaneously guilty and innocent. I cannot maintain the distance necessary to be effective." The major studied her for a long moment. "You've developed sympathy for the prisoners." It was not a question. It was an accusation. "I have developed understanding," she corrected. "Which is different and worse. Marie-Thérèse, we're at war. Understanding the enemy is useful for intelligence. But we cannot let it paralyze us. I am not paralyzed. I am broken. And there is a difference." But the major could not let her stop. The war needed translators. The final campaigns in Italy required people who could navigate the linguistic and psychological complexity of interrogations. Her experience was too valuable to lose. So she continued. Through September and October as Allied forces pushed toward Bologna. Through November as winter set in and combat slowed. Through December as the war ground toward its eventual conclusion. But something fundamental had changed. The breaking point had been reached. She continued translating, but she no longer believed in the utility of translation. She continued converting confessions from one language to another, but she no longer believed the confessions served any purpose except to document human capacity for horror. She had become a repository for guilt that was not her own. A witness to truths that contradicted each other. A woman who understood too much to maintain the comfortable certainty that war required. And in that understanding, she found not wisdom but isolation. Because the translator who hears confessions from both sides ultimately stands alone, carrying burdens that neither side acknowledges and that no one else can share. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended on a Tuesday. Marie-Thérèse was in Milan when news of Germany's surrender reached Allied headquarters. American soldiers cheered. Italian civilians emerged from buildings to celebrate in streets that had been empty for weeks. Church bells rang across the city for the first time in months. She stood in the courtyard of the building where she had been translating prisoner interviews and listened to the celebration. Joy surrounded her. Relief. Victory. The end of something terrible. But she felt nothing except exhaustion. A British captain found her standing alone and offered champagne that had been liberated from a German officer's private stock. She accepted the glass but did not drink. He asked if she was all right. She said yes. He thanked her for her service and returned to the celebration. After he left, she poured the champagne onto the cobblestones and watched it spread between the stones like dark blood. The war had ended. But what exactly had ended for her? The confessions she carried did not disappear with Germany's surrender. Klaus Weber's morphine-weakened voice asking, "Then why do we fight?" still echoed in her memory. Peter Hoffman's description of shooting a woman with a baby still replayed in perfect detail. The hundreds of other confessions she had translated still existed in the archives of her mind like documents that could never be destroyed. Victory had been achieved. Fascism had been defeated. The cause was just and the outcome was right. But Marie-Thérèse could not celebrate because she knew too much about the cost. Not just the material cost measured in casualties and destruction, but the psychological cost measured in confessions heard and guilt accumulated and understanding that made simplicity impossible. In June, the Red Cross began demobilizing translators. Marie-Thérèse submitted her resignation and prepared to return to Switzerland. On her final day in Milan, she was called to translate one last interview. The prisoner was an SS colonel who had been captured in the final days of fighting. He was being questioned about war crimes committed by his unit during the German retreat through northern Italy. Standard procedure. Document atrocities. Build cases for tribunals. Establish accountability. The American major conducting the interview asked the colonel about a massacre in a village near Parma. The colonel confirmed that his unit had conducted the operation. He provided details with clinical precision. Numbers killed. Methods used. Rationale based on partisan activity in the area. Marie-Thérèse translated his words into English. The same mechanical process she had performed 1,000 times. Convert one language to another. Preserve meaning while maintaining professional distance. But as she translated the colonel's description of burning families alive in their homes, she felt something inside her finally break completely. Not dramatically. Not with tears or visible emotion. Just a quiet internal collapse like a foundation giving way. When the interrogation ended, she walked out of the room and kept walking. Out of the building. Through the streets of Milan. She walked for 2 hours without destination or purpose, just moving through the city that was celebrating victory while she carried defeat. That evening, she returned to her quarters and wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific. Just words on paper that needed to exist outside her own mind. The letter began, "I have heard confessions from both sides of the war. I know things about soldiers that their families will never know. I understand truths about this conflict that contradict every simple narrative about good versus evil. And I do not know what to do with this understanding." She continued, "The German soldiers I translated for were not monsters. Some were true believers in evil ideologies. But most were just young men who wanted to survive. They confessed their fears to me because I spoke their language and they had no one else to tell. They described their guilt, their doubts, their horror at what they had become. And I carried those confessions while simultaneously translating for Allied officers who saw only enemies who deserved death." She wrote, "The Americans and British I worked for were not heroes. They were complicated men fighting a justified war through unjustifiable methods. They bombed cities. They killed prisoners. They celebrated their own atrocities when convenient. They confessed this to me not as crimes but as necessities. And I translated their words into something more palatable for official records." The letter concluded, "I no longer believe in translation. I no longer believe that converting words from one language to another serves any purpose except to make horror more efficient. I have spent 3 years facilitating communication between people who should never have been able to speak to each other. And all I have accomplished is to give voice to atrocities in multiple languages." She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She never sent it. Because who could she send it to? Who would understand the particular burden of the translator who exists between worlds? Marie-Thérèse returned to Geneva in July 1945. Her parents welcomed her home with relief. Friends and former colleagues asked about her war experiences with the kind of curious excitement that people reserve for stories they expected to be adventurous. She told them nothing substantive. Said she had worked as a translator. Said it had been difficult but important. Said she was glad to be home. They accepted these vague answers and did not press for details. How could she explain? How could she tell people who had lived through the war in neutral Switzerland about the confessions she had heard? About Klaus Weber and Peter Hoffmann and the SS colonel and the hundreds of other men whose guilt she carried like physical weight? She could not. So she remained silent. The University of Geneva offered her a position in the linguistics department. She declined. The Red Cross offered her a permanent position managing translation services. She declined. The Swiss Foreign Ministry suggested she might be valuable in diplomatic work. She declined. Everyone who asked why received the same answer: she needed time to recover. They assumed she meant physical recovery from the stress of war work. They did not understand she meant psychological recovery from truths that had fundamentally altered her understanding of human nature. She spent the autumn of 1945 in her parents' house in Geneva, reading books that had nothing to do with the war and walking along Lake Geneva's shore in weather that grew progressively colder. She avoided places where veterans gathered to share war stories. She refused invitations to lectures about the Allied victory. She existed in careful isolation from anything that might trigger the memories she was trying to suppress. But suppression did not work. The confessions remained. At night, she dreamed in multiple languages. Klaus Weber speaking German about photographing executions. Peter Hoffmann crying in German about shooting a baby. American soldiers speaking English about their fear. French resistance operatives speaking French about their hatred. All of them confessing to her. All of them seeking understanding she could not provide. She began experiencing what would later be recognized as symptoms of what was then called war neurosis, and would eventually be termed post-traumatic stress disorder. Inability to sleep. Intrusive memories. Emotional numbness interrupted by sudden intense anxiety. Difficulty connecting with people who had not experienced the war. But in 1945, these symptoms had no name and no treatment. She was simply a woman who had worked too hard for too long and needed rest. That was the diagnosis. That was the understanding. No one recognized that she suffered from a unique form of trauma. Not the trauma of combat or direct violence. But the trauma of understanding. The trauma of carrying other people's guilt. The trauma of existing between two narratives and believing in neither. In December, on the 6-month anniversary of VE Day, Marie-Thérèse attended a memorial service at Geneva's Cathedral of St. Pierre. The service honored Swiss citizens who had died during the war years. It was meant to be solemn and respectful. But during the minister's sermon about sacrifice and honor, she felt sudden overwhelming rage. What did these people know about sacrifice? What did they understand about honor? They had lived in Switzerland while the continent burned. They had maintained their comfortable neutrality while she had sat in interrogation rooms translating confessions from men who had murdered children and men who had ordered those murders and men who had witnessed those murders and done nothing. She left the cathedral before the service ended. Walked home through Geneva's clean streets where no buildings had been bombed and no bodies had littered the pavement. And understood with terrible clarity that she would never be able to return to the Switzerland she had left in 1940. Because she had seen what existed on the other side of neutrality. Had heard the confessions that revealed how thin the line was between civilization and barbarism. Had translated the words that proved every nation and every ideology and every soldier was capable of both heroism and horror. And she carried that knowledge alone. The translator who had heard confessions from both sides of the war. The woman who understood too much to ever be comfortable with simplicity again. The aftermath of her war would last longer than the war itself. 1947, 2 years after the war ended, Marie-Thérèse received a letter forwarded through the International Committee of the Red Cross. The return address was Munich, Germany. The handwriting was careful and formal. She recognized the name immediately. Klaus Weber. The German lieutenant she had translated for in the field hospital at Anzio. The engineering student who had confessed about photographing executions. The young man who had prayed not to have to kill anyone. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Klaus wrote in German. He had survived the war. Had spent 18 months in a POW camp in North Africa. Had returned to Munich in late 1946 to find his family's bookshop destroyed by Allied bombing. His father had died in the raid. His mother and sister had survived and were living with relatives in the countryside. He had tracked down Marie-Thérèse's name through Red Cross records. He wrote because he needed to tell her something. Needed to confess one more time to the woman who had understood him when he was wounded and morphine-confused and willing to speak truth. You ask me why we fight, he wrote. I have thought about that question for 3 years. And I have realized there is no satisfactory answer. We fight because circumstances make it seem necessary. Because propaganda makes it seem honorable. Because fear makes it seem inevitable. But none of these reasons justify what I witnessed and participated in. He continued, I think about the executions I photographed. About the villages we destroyed. About the people who died because I followed orders rather than conscience. And I cannot find forgiveness for myself. I cannot find meaning in survival when so many others did not survive. His letter concluded, You were kind to me when you did not have to be. You listened to confessions you should not have heard. You understood things that made your position more difficult. I wanted you to know that your understanding mattered. Even if it changed nothing about what I had done or what I would do. The fact that one person understood made the unbearable slightly more bearable. Marie-Thérèse read the letter 3 times. Then she placed it in a wooden box with the letter she had written to no one in May 1945. Documents of confession that existed outside official records. Private communications between people who had glimpsed the humanity underneath the war. She did not reply to Klaus. What could she say? That she forgave him. She had no standing to offer forgiveness. That she understood. She had already demonstrated understanding during their conversations in Anzio. That his confession made a difference. It did not. Men were still dead. Villages were still destroyed. The war had happened regardless of anyone's understanding. So she remained silent. And the silence felt like its own form of communication. An acknowledgement that some things existed beyond the capacity of words to resolve. Over the following years, she received 4 more letters from former prisoners she had translated for. A German sergeant who had surrendered near Bologna. An Italian soldier who had deserted and sought Allied protection. An Austrian conscript who had been captured during the final days of fighting. All of them writing to thank her for her understanding. For her kindness during interrogations. For treating them as humans rather than enemies. She did not reply to any of them. Not out of callousness. But because she understood that her role had never been to provide absolution. Only to bear witness. To translate their confessions and carry them forward. What they did with their own guilt was beyond her capacity to influence. In 1949, Marie-Thérèse finally agreed to speak publicly about her war experiences. A Swiss academic was conducting research on neutral nationals who had served in various capacities during the conflict. He interviewed her in her parents' house in Geneva. The interview lasted 3 hours. The academic asked about her training, her assignments, her experiences translating in different locations. She answered his questions with professional precision. Described her work without emotional commentary. Provided the kind of information that would fit neatly into academic analysis. At the end of the interview, the academic asked, "What was the most difficult aspect of your work?" Marie-Thérèse considered the question. She thought about Klaus Weber and Peter Hoffmann. About the SS colonel and the French resistance operative. About the hundreds of confessions she had translated and the impossible burden of understanding both sides. The most difficult aspect, she finally answered, was that translation is an act of empathy. To accurately convey meaning from one language to another requires understanding the speaker's perspective. And when you understand the perspectives of both sides in a conflict, you lose the ability to see either side as purely right or purely wrong. You become suspended between contradictory truths. And that suspension is unbearable. The academic wrote this down. Then asked a follow-up question, "Do you believe your work made a difference? Did the translations you provided help end the war?" She did not answer immediately. She thought about all the interrogations. All the confessions. All the information extracted and transmitted and converted into intelligence that informed military decisions that led to more deaths that led to eventual victory. "I believe my work made killing more efficient," she said. Which is not the same as making a difference. The academic published his research 2 years later. Marie-Thérèse's testimony was included in a chapter about linguistic workers in war zones. Her quote about translation and empathy was highlighted as particularly insightful. But reading her words in print, removed from the context of 3 years translating confessions in Italian interrogation rooms, Marie-Thérèse felt only emptiness. The academic had converted her experience into data. Had transformed her testimony into evidence supporting his thesis about the role of neutral nationals in total war. He had translated her truth into something that fit his narrative. And in that translation, something essential had been lost. Just as something essential was always lost in translation. By 1952, Marie-Thérèse had established a routine of careful isolation. She worked part-time at a library in Geneva. She lived alone in a small apartment near the university. She maintained minimal contact with people who had known her before the war. She read extensively. Philosophy, primarily. Camus and Sartre and writers who had struggled with questions about human nature and moral responsibility in the aftermath of European collapse. She found some comfort in recognizing that others had experienced the same existential confusion she felt. That the war had broken more than just cities and armies. She never married. Never had children. When acquaintances asked why, she provided vague answers about preferring independence. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. She could not imagine bringing children into a world where she had witnessed what humans were capable of doing to each other. The confessions she carried had fundamentally altered her understanding of humanity. She could not unhear Klaus Weber describing photographing executions. Could not forget Peter Hoffmann crying about shooting a baby. Could not erase the hundreds of other confessions that proved how easily ordinary people participated in extraordinary horror. And she could not reconcile that knowledge with the innocence required to raise children who believed the world was fundamentally good. In 1960, 15 years after the war ended, Marie-Thérèse was diagnosed with a chronic anxiety disorder. Her doctor prescribed medication and suggested therapy. She took the medication but declined therapy. How could she explain to a therapist that her anxiety stemmed from carrying 15-year-old confessions from soldiers on both sides of a war? That she existed in a permanent state of moral suspension between contradictory truths? That her understanding of human nature had been permanently damaged by 3 years translating horror from one language to another? She could not. So she lived with the anxiety. With the insomnia. With the intrusive memories that arrived without warning. With the burden of being the woman who heard confessions from both sides and who carried those confessions into a peacetime world that had no use for such knowledge. The legacy of her war was not heroism. Not victory. Not the satisfaction of having served a just cause. The legacy of her war was isolation. Understanding that led to emptiness. Knowledge that precluded comfort. She had translated truth from one language to another for 3 years. And what remained was the recognition that some truths could not be translated into anything except silence. 1965, 20 years after VE Day. Marie-Thérèse was 48 years old and looked 60. The chronic anxiety had carved lines into her face that made her appear perpetually exhausted. Her hair had gone gray in her early 40s. She moved through Geneva like a ghost haunting her own life. On the anniversary of the war's end, she did what she had done every May 8 since 1945, she walked to Lake Geneva's shore and spent the day alone, remembering. Not remembering victories or liberation or the justified celebration that had accompanied Germany's surrender. Remembering the confessions. One after another. In German and English and French and Italian. Voices that had been dead for 2 decades still speaking in her memory with perfect clarity. A young Swiss academic approached her on the lakeside path. He was conducting research on multilingual workers during the war. Had found her name in archives. Wanted to interview her about her experiences as a Red Cross translator. She declined. He persisted. Said her perspective was historically valuable. That understanding how translation worked in war zones could inform contemporary conflict resolution. That her testimony mattered. My testimony matters to no one, she told him in French. I translated confessions that led to more deaths. That is the only legacy of my work. But you helped end the war. The intelligence gathered through your translations made killing more efficient, she interrupted. I have already said this to another academic. I will not say it again for your research. The young man looked wounded. She felt no sympathy. He wanted to convert her experience into data that supported whatever thesis he was writing. He wanted to translate her truth into something academically respectable. But her truth was not respectable. Her truth was that she had spent 3 years facilitating interrogations that extracted information from men who confessed their humanity to her, and that information had been used to kill other men who would have confessed their humanity if given the chance. There was no academic framework that could contain that reality. She left the young academic standing on the lakeside path and returned to her apartment. That evening, she opened the wooden box that contained Klaus Weber's letter and the letter she had written to no one in May 1945. She read both documents. Then she added a third. A new letter. Addressed to no one. Written for the same reason someone might leave a message in a bottle. To document truth that had no destination. I am 48 years old, she wrote. I have lived longer than most of the men whose confessions I translated. Klaus Weber would be 43 if he still lives. Peter Hoffman would be 40 if he survived whatever psychological wounds I watched open in that interrogation room. The SS colonel is probably dead, executed for war crimes or suicide or simple old age. She continued, but their confessions remain alive in me. I carry their words like diseases that never heal. I translate their truths every day in my mind, converting past confessions into present understanding that serves no purpose except to remind me that I know things no person should know. The letter concluded, the weight does not diminish. 20 years have passed and the burden is identical to what I felt in May 1945. I thought time would provide distance. I thought new experiences would dilute the memories. But translation is permanent. Once you convert horror from one language to another, it exists in both languages forever. And I am fluent in 7 languages of guilt. She placed the letter in the wooden box with the others. Documents that would be discovered after her death by relatives who would not understand their significance. Confessions from a translator who had no one to translate for. In 1970, the Swiss government honored citizens who had served in various capacities during World War II. Marie-Thérèse received a formal letter inviting her to a ceremony in Bern where she would be recognized for her contributions to humanitarian work during the conflict. She burned the letter. Recognition was not what she needed. She needed release from the burden of understanding. She needed to forget Klaus Weber's morphine confession and Peter Hoffman's tears and the SS colonel's clinical description of burning families alive. She needed to unhear every confession she had translated. But memory does not work that way. Understanding does not diminish. The translator carries forward what she has heard, and there is no mechanism for depositing that burden anywhere except the grave. By 1975, Marie-Thérèse rarely left her apartment. She had retired from the library. Lived on a small pension. Spent her days reading and her nights not sleeping. People who had known her before the war occasionally visited, concerned about her isolation. She tolerated these visits with polite distance. Let them believe she was simply aging poorly. Let them attribute her withdrawal to natural reclusiveness rather than the specific trauma of carrying 30-year-old confessions from soldiers who had revealed their humanity in moments of weakness. One visitor, a cousin who had lived in Geneva throughout the war, asked her directly, "What happened to you during those years? You came back different. You never recovered." Marie-Thérèse considered telling the truth. About the interrogation rooms and the confessions and the impossible burden of understanding both sides. But she knew her cousin would not comprehend. Could not comprehend. Because comprehension required experience, and her experience was fundamentally untranslatable. "I learned too much about human nature," she finally answered. And the learning was permanent. Her cousin did not understand. But understanding was not the point. The point was documentation. The point was saying aloud what existed in her memory so that at least once, someone had heard it, even if they could not grasp its full meaning. In 1979, 34 years after the war ended, Marie-Thérèse Marchand died in her sleep in her Geneva apartment. She was 62 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure. But those who had known her understood she had simply exhausted her capacity to carry the weight. Her estate consisted primarily of books. But among her possessions, relatives found a wooden box containing 3 letters. One from a German lieutenant named Klaus Weber. 2 written by Marie-Thérèse to no recipient. The relatives read the letters but did not understand them. Filed them away with other documents from her life. Preserved them not because they recognized their significance, but because they seemed important to Marie-Thérèse and therefore deserved preservation. Those letters remain in a family archive in Geneva. Confessions from a war that ended before most current residents were born. Documents in languages that fewer people read each year. Testimony about experiences that grow increasingly abstract as direct memory fades into history. But the letters exist. And in existing, they document a truth that military histories ignore, that wars are fought not just on battlefields but in the psychological spaces between languages. That some people carry burdens invisible to others. That understanding both sides of a conflict can be more destructive than understanding neither side. Marie-Thérèse Marchand was the translator who heard confessions from both sides of the war. And the weight of those confessions did not diminish with time. Did not resolve into wisdom. Did not transform into meaning. It remained a burden. Carried alone. Until death provided the only translation that could convert understanding into silence. Today, there are no memorials for translators. No monuments honoring the linguistic workers who facilitated communication between armies. No ceremonies recognizing those who existed in the spaces between languages, converting confessions and orders and pleas from one tongue to another. Marie-Thérèse Marchand's name appears in some Red Cross archives. Listed among thousands of workers who served in various capacities during the conflict. Her specific contributions are noted in bureaucratic shorthand, translator, multiple languages, Italian theater, 1943 to 1945. The notation does not capture what she actually did. Does not document the hundreds of interrogations. Does not describe the confessions she heard or the burden she carried. Does not acknowledge the unique trauma of understanding both sides so completely that she could no longer believe in either. Because translation is invisible work. Translators disappear behind the words they convert. Their understanding facilitates communication for others but leaves them suspended between the speakers. They become conduits. Vessels. Bridges that everyone crosses without acknowledging the bridge itself. But bridges bear weight. And some bridges collapse under loads they were never designed to carry. The letters Marie-Thérèse left behind document a truth that historians rarely acknowledge, that wars create casualties beyond the battlefield. That psychological wounds can be as devastating as physical wounds. That understanding can be more destructive than ignorance. Klaus Weber's letter to Marie-Thérèse described her understanding as making the unbearable slightly more bearable. But her own letters suggest the opposite. That her understanding made nothing more bearable. That empathy for both sides created paralysis rather than insight. That existing between languages meant existing between certainties, and that space was ultimately unbearable. The translator's dilemma is this: to accurately convey meaning requires understanding the speaker's perspective. But when you understand both sides in a conflict, you lose the comfortable distance that allows judgment. You see the humanity in everyone. And when everyone is human, simple moral categories collapse. Marie-Thérèse heard German soldiers confess their exhaustion and doubt. Heard Allied soldiers confess their fear and guilt. Heard civilians on both sides describe the same displacement and hunger and desire for the war to end. And in hearing all of it, she accumulated knowledge that made the war simultaneously justified and unjustifiable. The cause was just. Fascism had to be defeated. But the methods were horrific. And everyone participating bore guilt regardless of which uniform they wore. This was what translation taught her. This was what 3 years converting confessions from one language to another had revealed. That war reduced everyone to the same fundamental humanity. That ideologies mattered less than survival. That the distance between hero and war criminal was often just circumstance and choice made under impossible pressure. These truths did not make her wise. They made her isolated. Because wisdom requires synthesis, and she could find no synthesis. Could not reconcile the contradictions. Could not convert her understanding into anything except silence. The academic who interviewed her in 1949 called her testimony about translation and empathy particularly insightful. But insight without resolution is not wisdom. It is just unmetabolized knowledge that accumulates like toxin in blood. Marie-Thérèse carried that toxin for 34 years after the war ended. Carried confessions from men who died or grew old while she remained suspended in the moment they confessed. Carried understanding that led nowhere except to recognition that some human experiences cannot be translated into meaning. The letters she left behind are documents of that impossibility. Attempts to translate her own experience into words that others might understand. But as she herself noted, translation is always incomplete. Always loses something in the conversion from one language to another. What was lost in her translations? The fear that existed beneath the words. The guilt that colored every confession. The humanity that made simple categories impossible. And what was lost in attempting to translate her experience for others? The weight. The burden of carrying hundreds of confessions. The psychological exhaustion of existing between two narratives and believing in neither. These losses are permanent. Cannot be recovered. Cannot be documented in ways that convey their full impact. Which means Marie-Thérèse's experience remains largely untranslatable. Exists in archives as notation rather than understanding. Preserved as data rather than truth. But the letters exist. And in existing, they testify to a reality that deserves documentation even if it resists translation. That wars are fought not just by soldiers but by everyone who facilitates violence. That understanding can be as heavy as weapons. That some people carry burdens invisible to everyone else but no less real for their invisibility. Marie-Thérèse Marchand was the translator who heard confessions from both sides of the war. And what remains of her life is this: testimony to the weight of understanding. Documentation of the cost of existing between languages. Evidence that some experiences leave marks deeper than scars. The lake in Geneva where she walked every May 8 still reflects the mountains. The streets she traversed in her careful isolation still carry pedestrians who know nothing of what she witnessed. The apartment where she died has been occupied by new residents who found nothing significant about its previous tenant. But the letters remain. In a family archive. In languages that fewer people read. Confessions from a woman who translated confessions. Documentation of experiences that resist documentation. And perhaps that is sufficient legacy. Not monuments or ceremonies. Not historical recognition or academic analysis. Just letters. Proof that someone carried the weight. That someone heard what others said in moments of weakness and carried those words forward even when carrying them became unbearable. Marie-Thérèse Marchand translated truth from one language to another for 3 years. And what translation left behind was not wisdom or insight or understanding that could be transmitted to others. What translation left behind was simply this: evidence that the space between languages is also a space between certainties. That existing in that space requires carrying contradictions. That some burdens cannot be shared because they exist in a territory too specific to be communicated. She was the bridge that carried confessions from both sides. And when the confessions became too heavy, the bridge did not collapse. It simply bore the weight. Silently. Alone. Until it could bear no more. That is what translation leaves behind. The weight. The silence. The testimony that some truths cannot be translated into anything except the recognition that translation itself is insufficient. And in that insufficiency lies the only honesty available to those who exist between worlds, hearing confessions that neither side will acknowledge and carrying understanding that leads nowhere except to the recognition of its own limits.